You gotta find a way. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ooh, you gotta find a way. You've gotta find. Ooh, you gotta find a way. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ooh, you gotta find a way. You've gotta find.
Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have two special guests with us. We have Napasha Dar, who you may have seen, who you probably will have seen on the channel before. And we also have Dr. Lena Einhorn. So for today's interview, Napar will be your host and Napar will be conducting this interview. Over to you, Napar.
Thank you so much, Esoteric. I'm very excited to be here with both of you, but I just want to get all these questions out. But can you just briefly let us know, you said you studied Christianity, you said you studied the Hebrew faith, your Jewish background. What happened where you said, wait a minute, there's a discrepancy between New Testament and these writings of Josephus? Because with your book, just to let the audience know, you examined the New Testament and you found a lot of very unconventional discoveries. So let's start with you and the discrepancies that you found between Josephus, his accounts of history, and the actual New Testament.
Okay, so if you want me to take it from the beginning, can you give me like 5 minutes?
Of course.
Okay,
of course.
Because then I'll tell you how I arrived at this. So I was doing some documentary for television, and I guess this was in 2005. And no, let's start from the beginning. So in the early 80s, we're talking 40 years ago, I'm sitting at the dinner and somebody says to me, you know, Jesus didn't die on the cross. And, you know, as I said, you know, I'd studied Christianity in school. It was that, and the thought just went like, wham, bam, 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 bam. You know, sometimes somebody says something and it goes like in a microsecond, you start getting, oh my God, that makes sense. You know, he came down from the cross, he showed himself, and the Romans, Pontius Pilate washed his hands. You know, yeah, it makes sense. And then, so what really happened? Oh, so he must, the Romans didn't want to kill him, so they made a deal with him. So he left the country. They would take him down if he left the country, and bam, 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 bam. You know, this is how it went, like in less than a second in my head. I just thought, wow, that's intriguing. Now, I didn't know then, but of course, since then, there are many books written with this hypothesis that he didn't die on the cross. I mean, you know, this isn't the first, but I didn't know about it. In any event, so the next thing, maybe a few minutes later, that hits me then, we're talking early 80s, is, okay, so he was like 31, 33, he left the country. So did he just retire? You know, this is a major preacher with great aspirations one would have, even if one looks at it historically and not religiously. Obviously, a person who's influential, especially if he was in the trial with the highest dignitaries of the empire. Did he just retire? And then the thought hit me, when did Paul show up? And I realized, well, Paul showed up outside on the road to Damascus around the time of Jesus' crucifixion, or shortly thereafter, according to the chronology. And so I thought, could they be the same person? And this was like a thought at a dinner, and that was it. I left it. It was just that dinner. I didn't do anything with it. I did one thing with it, but then I sort of just left it. 25 years later, I'm at, it must have been some project that fell through or something. I had nothing on my list, in my pipeline. I'm standing in a bookstore in Sweden, in Stockholm. I'm looking up and I'm at the religion section. And it's the New Testament. And I just decide then and there, I'm going to explore this. So I bought a bunch of books and I started exploring. Okay, could they be the same guy? It was like, it was just for fun. But how did I approach it? I approached it by looking at the historical sources. And the most important historical source from that era, of that realm, without any comparison, is Josephus Flavius, who was a Roman Jewish historian, an aristocrat, who wrote about the Jewish war, who wrote about Jewish history, and he did it after the Jewish war, when everybody thought it was the end of the Jewish people. It was the end. And so he took it all down, and he is our main historical source of that realm. He's uncomparable. Nobody compares with anything but Josephus, basically. There are a few little sources outside, but it's really Josephus is the comparison that you make with the New Testament. Because the New Testament is also a historical source, right? It names all these, emperors and high priests and tetrarchs and kings. And so they're all there in the New Testament, and they're all there in Josephus, okay? So that's how I approached the issue. I started comparing them. And very soon, I ran into problems. And this is a problem for anybody doing historical Jesus research. Outside of the New Testament, there are no parallels. The names are there. The names of the high priests, the names of the Roman procurators, the names of the emperors and kings and everything, they're all there. But they don't do the same thing. And you don't find Jesus there. Not before the 2nd century, when you start getting texts about Jesus. But from that time, from the 1st century, you don't find Jesus. You don't find his disciples. And this is the problem for all historical Jesus scientists, scholars. So what is the common conclusion of this? There are two main trains of thought. The first one, the main one, is, well, he was a messianic Jewish leader in the time of the Romans, before the Jewish war, but he was not better known than all the other ones. And Josephus names, a bunch of them. And the less common thought is he didn't exist at all. So those are the two main thoughts. I mean, everybody has to tackle this issue that you don't find him in the history books. So they tackle it by either saying he was not well known in his own time, he became better known later, or he didn't exist.
Becomes Peace and War Times. This is Zane Kotsvela Chitnupu, and I'm going to be responding to Dr. Einhorn's conversations throughout this wonderful interview. And so I'm going to just interject at certain points. All right, so so let's get to it. Listen to reason. This writer will address certain points to add more clarity that Dr. Lena Einhorn makes concerning this topic. Point 1, she says during the 2nd century is when texts or writings about Jesus began to appear. Here are the reasons why. So by 300 or 400 BC, around the time the last book of the Old Testament is supposed to have been written, there was hardly any need for a prophet because the Phoenicians were so well scattered. But there were various writings between 400 BC, and 1 BC by priests and prophets that should be a part of the Old Testament, but are not, because they tell of the cruel persecution and atrocities that preceded the appearance of Jesus. The darker peoples of the regions controlled by Caucasians were forced to accept the Caucasian new version of Christianity. St. Matthew 23rd chapter 15th verse, which came out of the Alexandrian schools of Egypt around 300 BC. And I always encourage people to get you a Catholic Bible because it has 72 books in it.
12 o'clock.
And it's 6 books more than the King James. And there's other books you can find now that were originally a part of a bigger book, or say, well, not book, because they didn't have books then, but other ways of writing scrolls and stuff like that. And in the Catholic Bible, that book talks about what they would say Greeks and Romans who was doing crazy stuff according to the writers of those books that were taken out, or those scrolls that should have been a part of the Old Testament. Once again, the Romans and Greeks were Caucasian. So this is one of the main reasons why a lot of things were removed, and why a lot of these people back then with those biblical names are not necessarily pulled up the forefront to show you who those people were. But yet, when you watch movies about ancient times, cartoons, books, even pictures in their Bibles, most of the people they have are Caucasian. But what they do is they make it where the good people were Caucasian getting slaughtered, and then the bad people who were doing the slaughtering were Caucasian. You understand? But that's all a part of the game. But it's part of telling you that those people who put this stuff together knew what race of people that they was coming from, because race is very important, not for what people would try to say it is, but because it's important for the contextual, so you can read something and know who's who. That's like somebody trying to solve a case, or say a crime occurred and the police show up, and you could tell them everything that happened, but you fail to tell who were there. They're going to tell you specifically, we need to know what race was the color, what skin, you know what I'm saying, what race was the person, the skin color, the hair, you understand? Though racial identity, no matter how these people in America try to flip-flop it and make people think it's bad to talk about race, it's part of a description to be accurate. The same thing when they go back and digging up these and all these lands and stuff like that, they doing that to what? To get a better description. You can't just say, yeah, we know that humans lived in ancient Egypt, and we're going to ignore what we see. We're not going to dig up nothing. We're just going to know. That's not enough. Accuracy and being able to detail and know what the person, place, or thing look like and behave, all that stuff is a part of it. All right? Don't let them fool you. All right? This is for educational purposes. All right? Which came out of the Alexandrian schools of Egypt around 300 BC. The Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, from which the Latin and English versions was compiled, collected after Alexander the Great, the Greek, marched unopposed into Egypt and northern Africa around 333 BC. The Septuagint was published several decades later, around 300 BC. And this means that the Jews did not have an organized Bible until the Greek version was compiled, for they had been using various scrolls and parchments for their religious rituals and rites. Moreover, The Jews were well schooled in the Cabal system, a system of mystery words and clandestine know-how passed down from father to son and mother to daughter orally, but never put in writing. There have been many versions and revisions of the Septuagint, the Old Testament, since its compilation and publication around 300 BC. The 70 or 72 emissaries from Jerusalem, those were supposed to be the ones who compiled the Old Testament, are the people who were persuaded to change the writings to suit the purpose of the Caucasian rulers at the time of the advent of Jesus. Apparently, the Jews had not yet claimed the Ethiopians and Phoenician bondage and captivities of the Old Testament as their own, as evidenced by this written statement, St. John 8, chapter 33. What is that? John 8, chapter 33 verse. All right, and I'm going to read that real quick so we can look at that. What does it say? St. John chapter 38 verse. All right, let's go to that real quick. St. John chapter 8, 33. All right, now according to chapter John chapter 8, verse 33, it says what? They answered him saying, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free? So again, not only is Afro Unu saying that this particular verse in John is right and exact, it also goes with what we said before. In the Hyksos, which is we talking about that particular part of the Caucasian race, which is we call the Jews today, they invaded Kemet. They were around 2000 BC, right? So they were never enslaved. What they were doing was oppressing the dark-skinned Phoenician pharaohs like Akhmos to Thutmose the first, and they had to get them out of there, and that's what happened. So that particular chapter and verse is right and exact. Okay. Jews and other Caucasians, if given the opportunity in the future, will also claim the enslavement of the American Negro as enslavement of the Caucasian, as the Jews claim the enslavement of the Egyptian as the enslavement of Jews. Moreover, in reading the Bible, people make the mistake of concerning too much on what God or Jesus is supposed to have said and too little emphasis on the other side of the argument. And through this era, people miss valuable information and eye-open knowledge, which refute many biblical and Caucasian claims. For example, like you said, they focus on what they said versus what they did, okay? Or what wasn't said, you understand? Because a lot of the people try to do that. They'll try to focus on what one side instead of looking at the whole thing. All right. It said, eye-opening knowledge which refute many biblical and Caucasian claims, not only by words, but also by what actually took place before and then took place since and is taking place now. In other words, note that secular history does not coincide with those claims, and that the Caucasians are still doing today what they did then, claiming one thing and then doing another, and this makes them history's best known hypocrites and provocateurs. And again, this is easily understood if you study what the Catholic Church has done. Again, simple and plain, just knowing that they took books out of circulation, touching kids and all that stuff, and all the evils that they done set up, the Jesuits having religious, spiritual, Masonic hitmen all around the world. There's no way that these people can be telling the truth when they've done so much evil in the world. Okay, that's just one of the religions, because they're not the only ones, but you can look at all of the historical evidence and that it'll bear itself out. All right. So there is a time span of 300 or 400 years between the Old and New Testament, because one, the Hebrews, the Phoenicians were too well scattered before there was little need for a prophet. Two, after the Old Testament was compiled and published around 300 BC, any biblical writing in BC after that would have to been an an unauthorized addition to the Old Testament, and there are unauthorized additions that are not published in the King James Version, such as Baal and the Dragon, the Wisdom of Jesus, the Maccabees, etc. And there were many words and works that went on between 400 BC and 1 BC, which the Caucasians did not want known, such as the persecutions and atrocities Caucasians used to eliminate Egyptian pantheism before they finished it off around the time of Jesus. Question: why are there 4 similar books about the same story at the beginning of the New Testament instead of 1? Because in reorganizing Christianity after the death of Jesus, the Caucasians had no proof of their stories, particularly the parts pertaining to the Immaculate Conception and Resurrection of Jesus. The reorganizers of Christianity could not bring out the parts about the Immaculate Conception and Resurrection until scores of years after the death of Jesus, because the people living in his time and for years after knew better. Therefore, they could not publish with success these additions to the story about Jesus until the people who knew better had died out and certain parts of the true story had been concealed. It was not until around 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea, that reorganized Christianity really began to flourish in the form that we know it today, because the new concepts called Immaculate Conception and Resurrection had been added by that time. Alright, this is a little timeline that you can see. Alright, so they starting from here to here is the 70 AD, the fall of Jerusalem, where the Hyksos were. Alright, called the Jews today. These are the Hyksos. So from 70 all the way to here, you got 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea, and then you had 313, the Edict of Milan, and it goes on 538, the Benedict's rule, 800 AD, the coronation, you had the Crusades, 1096 AD, the Great Schism, 1054, and so forth and so forth. 292 years after the Hyksos, aka the original Romans and Greeks, murdered the last Phoenician Egyptian pharaoh that represented Egyptian pantheism, and they started establishing their own moon culture called monotheism. Okay? And the reason why we're saying that is because the Hyksos, or the Jews, when they came into Kemet and started working their way up, especially under Khufu, they were allowed to study the arts and sciences, and one of those was called a Memphite theology. And this is where the Bible actually got a lot of information from, but they changed it and tried to say it's Sumerian. But the Memphite theology is the basis and most accurate when it talks about creation and the primordial waters and stuff like that. All right. This is some of the stuff they was talking about at the Council of Nice. All right, was the deity of Jesus Christ invented in 325 at the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea did involve the deity of Christ, but the concept certainly was not invented at this meeting, nor did it relate at all to the formation of the canon. The Council of Nicaea was called because a bishop named Arius was claiming that Jesus, because he was begotten of God, was not of the same substance or essence as God. The meeting resulted in the establishment of Nicene Creed, which states that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all the ages, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made of one substance with the Father. It's amazing how this religion, Catholicism, was based off the man they nicknamed Jesus, murdered to create their own version, were arguing about their delusion that he was alive, knowing they killed him 292 years earlier, is pure insanity. The earlier forms of Christianity, such as the beginning of St. John, did not have the later ideas called Immaculate Conception and the Resurrection in the sense that it is taught in the West. However, original Christianity did start with the Osiris and Set legend, which is based on the true story about Abel and Cain. Christianity before that, based on Jesus of 2,000 years ago broke out around 560 or 600 BC when the Phoenicians' power began to wane and Caucasian power began to wax. These earlier forms of Christianity started with Greek philosophers such as Pythagoras, Hippocrates, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc., who received their knowledge from the Egyptian mystery systems. All right, so what people don't really understand is that the Hyksos, who had got power around the time Thutmose the First came into play, then they got depowered, dethroned, and ran back to Asia. You got to remember the Hyksos, so the Jews had 1,000-year culture jump on the rest of the Caucasians, and they wouldn't share their power with the rest of them. So when they lost power, and Thutmose the Second, Thutmose the Third, and Hatshepsut, who was pretty much pushing the power of Phoenician Egyptian rule from Africa to Europe and Asia around 600 BC, they started losing power. And at this time, the other part of the white race, which is you talking about Rome, started to increase. Greek started to increase. And so by the time you get to around 300 something BC, Alexander and them got in there, and then they went and started getting power and getting all of the knowledge that the Jews had learned a couple hundred years before them. All right? Because remember, they went into Kemet in 2000 BC. So all the way from 2000 BC all the way down to when they got kicked out of Kemet around 1600 or so, that's almost 700 years, they got pushed back into Asia. Some of them stopped off into Jerusalem according to some of the history, but that's pretty much where they were at. And because the rest of the Caucasians who they wouldn't share power with, is why the beef has been amongst, when you start looking at how Jews was traveling throughout that time, like around Jesus' time and after that, and you look into the writings, you see how Jews were treated nasty, whether they was in Rome or when they was in Greece. Especially when you get down to like when they start doing a Pope thing. I watched a lot of different documentaries and movies and stuff, and you always see that the Jews were treated a certain way no matter where they went, especially in the ancient time. And the reason was because when the Jews were in Kemet living it up in Upper Egypt, they didn't shoot none of their knowledge and power to the rest of their brethren and sistren of their race. That's why you see people, when you watch these movies, you'll see them being mistreated. But the root of it goes back to that. When they was in Kemet getting all that knowledge, they didn't share that. Okay? All right, so it said, so who received their knowledge from the Egyptian mystery systems? That was, so these are some of the people that got some of this knowledge. All right, you got Pythagoras, Hippocrates, see, 570, 400. Remember, all this stuff is because the Phoenician Egyptians started losing power around 600 BC. So as they started losing power, these individuals eventually started popping up and getting all this philosophy. This is why when you start looking at what happened, when they started getting this information, they was the ones who was giving the people in Rome a hard time. That's why they used to take their knowledge back to Rome and Greece, and they started having these battles. But because this knowledge came from darker peoples, the Phoenicians who invaded Kemet when we was ruling, as woolly-haired Ethiopian African individuals, they learned stuff from us, and then the Caucasians learned under the Jews, which was the Hyksos, right? So what you're looking at, if you look at the dates, see, all this is after 600, when the black Phoenicians, straight-haired people like Arabs and stuff today, they started losing power, and these people got this knowledge, And when they took it back into Rome and all of that, that's when they had this problem. And Rome, around the time Constantine came up, they couldn't do nothing with these people with the knowledge they had until religion got a stronghold. That's when they created a religion based around the knowledge that came out of Egypt in the first place, because that's where these people got this stuff from. So all they did was take the information that these guys was already teaching, and they reworked it in such a way that they created a white version of the Egyptian information that was already there, and some of Zoroastrianism and things like that that was part of what Rome them had, because they didn't have a religion. The information came from darker peoples. All right, so you talking about from 500 something all the way down to like 333 BC. That's when Alexander the Greek came in. Before this, you talking about Rome, because the original Romans were Jewish. So these are the original Romans and Greeks. But when Alexander got there, a lot of information, he came in like 333 BC. So they had these guys had like a 200-year jump before Alexander got there. So by the time they got to 325 AD and a little bit later on, they had enough power to suppress the information that these guys had got out of Egypt and started putting these guys in jail, house arrest. Some of them had to take poison because the knowledge they was kicking was black knowledge that darker peoples did the studying and brought this stuff, and they didn't have anything. These people just literally went over there and sat and learned and came back with information. By the time Alexander them got there, a lot of these people, even before his time, just took that information and put their names on it and it went back to their folks. And that's why in history you see they talk about things and they have all this information, but they can't tell you how they got to it. Like they talk about the beginning of the world and the universe, and they was the last race of people to come on the planet. So how y'all coming up with all this information when it was never even known when you studied Rome and Greece before these individuals like these were there? You wouldn't find this type of information. This is why when they went back from Egypt or Kemet to Rome and Greece, these people were treated hostile because they didn't come up with that information. And they was jealous and upset and also afraid of that type of knowledge. Because if they came up with this knowledge, why would y'all go back teaching it to your own? And they like, what are you talking about? So these people are not the world's first teachers and the philosophers. They got this stuff from other people, which is the Phoenicians who got it from us. All right. Plato and Aristotle. And lastly, I didn't put his name on here. Sheesh. Socrates. All right. Headed by Egyptian priests, prophets, and other mystic men. Of course, the first and earliest form of Christianity started with Cain. The beginning of the loss of Egyptian power, freedom, and independence is when the Egyptians let Greeks and other Caucasians into their mystery systems, from which they obtained vast knowledge, secrets, and activating names of gods and goddesses. The Egyptians had what was called mysteries and also greater mysteries that Phoenicians, later day Egyptians, took the Caucasian into their confidence, and that was the beginning of the end of the Egyptian power and rule. That's another thing they have to look at, because they wasn't just getting knowledge, it was secrets and activating names of gods and goddesses, which are forces of nature that are conscious and do and will react to you if you know their names. So this is the real power that was back in ancient Kemet. All right, but they try to demonize it, like when they played stuff like Moses, and you start talking about what happened, and Pharaoh did magic, and then Moses did the same thing. But they'll say, oh, what Pharaoh doing was evil. But if Moses was doing the same thing, what difference does it make? Oh, because it was God. But again, Moses, according to the story, knew the name of God. And when he asked, and when he first met God, said, who are you? He said, I am that I am. All right, so that's a name. You see what I'm saying? And he took his shoes off and all the soda. These, all of the gods, I don't care which one it is. Earth god, water god, underworld god, it don't matter. Zupu god, Nupu god, if you don't know their names, they're not gonna, you can't activate them. In a sense, not like activate them like you cutting on a computer, but be able to talk to them directly, like the 9 orbs. I talk to them, they talk back to me. So it's different levels to this. All right. Alexander the Great, that is the Greek, was a member of the Egyptian mystery system, and by the time he came on the scene around 333 BC, the way was clear for just about anything the Caucasians wanted to put forth. And this is why Alexander was able to march unopposed into Egypt, Eastern and Northern Africa, and elsewhere. Although Alexander had sworn his alliance and allegiance to the objectives of the Egyptian mystery system, of which he was a member, he was also a member of a vast clandestine spy system of Caucasians whose aim was to deceive and deprive the Phoenicians of their ruling power and independence. The first member of the spy ring that joined the mystery system was the first Caucasian accepted into the mystery system, because that is the nature of the Caucasian, to deceive and spy on darker peoples. The Caucasian spy ring was the key that opened and cleared the way for Alexander's march. Once the Caucasians were admitted into the mysteries of Egypt, of course, the power they received would turn adverse like the Caucasians were, and that adverse power was enough to make the spy system successful by help of the moon god, Caucasian women, and some of the Phoenicians themselves who were spellbound by the moon god. Again, another magical element that is taken out of the story, and they just show, oh yeah, Alexander just walked up into Egypt and stuff like that and all this and that, and then he turned on them. But people never look at the other side of that. This is exactly the same stuff we doing now. That's why everything we do to this day, they watching you. They got a commercial now that when they talking about new phones and all that, they took that song, every search you make, everything you take, I'll be watching you. And it's talking about people using the phone online and getting on the computer, your bank transactions. That's a spying system. This is nothing new. They've been doing this and steady taking your freedom. But because the information been so obscured, people don't realize that. This is how they got into positions of power. All right? But they had help from the moon god. Tahuti. Alexander the Greek was falsely built up as a great conqueror, but he was a fake who the Caucasian spy system chose to take the bows for the work the spy system had done. However, most Greek philosophers and members of the spy system who were also members of the mystery system met with ill fate for their deceit and broken vows to the laws of the mysteries. That means that they were killed for telling the secrets, much like today when you join these secret societies and Masons and stuff like that, and you can see certain Masonic groups have a head with a scimitar or a sharp sword underneath the head, mean if you tell, they're gonna cut your head off. It's the same principles. All right, this is where the original snitching comes from, and when you apply it to Masonry, we let you in, we hook you up, we gonna do some things. If you talk or tell, we gonna get rid of you. And this is what the streets are like, a more caveman version of that, because they don't understand certain realities that come with this. All right, but we're gonna move forward. All right, and to the laws of the mystery school, the philosophy they taught was from darker peoples and foreign to their people, and their people were afraid of it at first. And the teachers of the new philosophy, who were not put to death, died in shame and disgrace, including Alexander, who died of intemperance, drunkenness at the early age of 32, allegedly. The Alexandrian Christian schools in Egypt that started around 300 BC and were named in honor of Alexander the Greek produced such early Christians and Reformed Jews as the Stoics, Gnostics, Essenes, Zealots, and others who lasted until the advent of Jesus and for a time after. But the Essenes, who were called Zealots, and some others became a part of Jesus' followers. Subsequently, the four Gospels, the first four books at the beginning of the New Testament, had no factual backing when the Immaculate Conception and resurrection concepts were organized and became doctrine prior to the Council of Nice, 325 AD. Therefore, the organizers at the council decided to publish four similar books and proclaim that the four eyewitnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who had no contact with each other, wrote the books in four different places at the same time. Plus, the similarities amongst the four books supposed to prove the Gospels, but that is no proof because there would have to be further proof of the four eyewitnesses who had no contact with each other and wrote their books in different places at the same time. Therefore, three of the books were produced from the original one, St. John, of the four, or all four from a fifth book, the Osiris Egyptian Book of the Dead, which the public has never seen. Remember, this book was written in 1968. So when Afro Uno or Amenubi Rakapata stated that, most of the public hadn't seen or even heard of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. All right, the same way a lot of people didn't know it was a Book of the Dead until they watched the Mummy movie 1 and 2. All right, so since we know that the Jesus that Dr. Einhorn and others are talking about now are starting to understand the real nationality of Jesus versus the lies that the Catholic Church and them put out there. Y'all are now starting to get more information about that. In other words, Caucasians could tell the people anything after those who knew the true story had died out or were put to death. The Caucasian title of the Bible is Holy Bible, but the universal title of the Bible is Book of the Dead because it is from the dead and it's for the deaf, the physical and mental dead. And this is why we see the same symbol on the church house of the mental dead that we see in the cemetery place of the physical dead. The symbol to which we refer to as the cross, the sign of the dead, physical and mental. Cross is a word that refers to crescent, and crescent refers to the moon, a dead universal body which supports and multiplies the physical and mental dead and their forces on planet Earth. The Egyptian Book of the Pyramids, the cemetery, and Book of the Dead, the Bible, were magnified by Tahuti, sometimes called Thoth or Hermes Trismegistus, the moon god, also known as Anubis. Throwing away such false concepts as Immaculate Conception, physical resurrection of Jesus, and ascension were able to take roots and grow in the first place is because it was the time and season for such fabrications. Christianity, as we know it today, took roots at the Council of Nice, 325 AD, and other councils since then, including the Council of Chalcedon, 451 AD. And however, this word always get me, Protestantism came later, and that shall be discussed in the next answer. The etymological meaning of the word gospel is ghost spell or spell of the ghost, meaning spell of God. Ghost works by spell or fascination and is therefore spellbinding, and nine-ether works by reason, though through knowledge and wisdom and understanding. What is presented in booklets called the Bible Interpretation and Explanation discloses part of the true history of the Bible, little known or unknown to woolly-haired people. Disclosure of the true history of the Bible is knowledge, and that knowledge helps to destroy ignorance of the oppressed and helps to open the escape route to liberty and equality by the mental process and progresses. Bible Interpretation, Book 2, Numbers 23 through 24, written 1968. In the case of Jesus, the resurrection was a fabricated story designed to deceive the world, just as the story of Immaculate Conception and Ascension was fabricated to spellbind the people also. Religion, history show record of at least 14 such stories like that of Jesus, all existing before the time of Jesus. Those stories like that of Jesus were impractical and illogical. They were allegory. All of those virgin-born resurrection ascension tales were mainly Indian legends in the East and West. Originally, however, the life, death, resurrection, ascension story came from the Ethiopian woolly-haired people, but when only the Ethiopian had it, it was understood that the story was a description of the works of nature. But when the Caucasian got hold of the story from the Phoenicians, they took the real understanding out of it and used the story to fascinate the darker peoples into spiritual ignorance and gullibility for the purpose of oppression and exploitation. Bible Interpretation and Explanation, Book 2, number 74, also written in the same book, 1968 AD. Let's continue.
You gotta